When my lawyer read aloud the cruelty clause from my late husband's true will, the expressions on my son Daniel and my daughter-in-law Chloe's faces shifted from smug satisfaction to absolute horror. Their multi-million-dollar inheritance had just sprouted wings and flown directly to a cat sanctuary. My name is Evelyn Reed, and at 72 years old, I thought my life was a closed book, its pages filled with quiet sacrifice and the gentle rhythms of a life lived for others. For 45 years, I dedicated myself to my family, first to my beloved husband Frank, and then, with every fiber of my being, to our only son Daniel. When he brought Chloe home, I welcomed her not as a daughter-in-law, but as the daughter I never had. I poured every ounce of my love into building a family I believed was my life's greatest work, a fortress of love against the harshness of the world. I was the steadfast matriarch, the comforting presence, the woman who would give anything for their happiness. I never imagined that in their eyes, I was simply an obstacle, a placeholder, a bank account waiting to be emptied. They had forgotten one crucial detail about the foundation of our family fortress. My husband, Frank, had always been a much better judge of character than I was, and he had built in a secret failsafe. The constant, rhythmic hum of my old Singer sewing machine was the soundtrack to Daniel's childhood. It was a sound of love, of sacrifice. Night after night, long after Frank had gone to bed, I would sit hunched over in the soft glow of a single lamp, the needle dancing under my worn fingers as I took on extra jobs. I sewed wedding gowns for hopeful brides, mended suits for important men, and crafted curtains that would hang in the windows of other happy families. Each stitch was a small prayer, a penny saved, that coalesced into the tuition for Daniel's business degree at the University of Michigan. He would come home on holidays, his face bright with the promise of a world I had helped open for him, and hug me so tightly I could barely breathe. "One day, Mom, I'll pay you back for everything," he'd promise, his voice thick with youthful sincerity. I never wanted to be paid back. His success was my only desired currency. Years later, when he and Chloe found the perfect starter home, the down payment was just out of their reach. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the small velvet-lined jewelry box on my dresser and took out the sapphire necklace my own mother had given me on my wedding day. It was my most precious possession, a link to my own past. Selling it felt like severing a limb, but the memory of that pain vanished when I saw the unadulterated joy on their faces as they held the keys to their new life. Love, I had always believed, was measured in these quiet, unseen sacrifices. And Chloe, in those early years, she was the very picture of a devoted daughter. She didn't just call me Evelyn. She called me Mom with a sweetness that could melt the winter snow. She would spend entire Saturdays in my kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, insisting on learning the secret to my apple pie, the one Frank had always said was the best in the state. "Oh, Mom," she would sigh, her eyes wide with what I was convinced was genuine admiration. "You've built such a beautiful life, such a wonderful family. I promise I will take care of Daniel, and I will take care of you, always." Her words were the fulfillment of every mother's dream. She praised the simple pot roasts I cooked as if they were feasts fit for royalty, and listened to my old stories with a patient, engaged smile. She made me feel seen, valued, and loved. I saw in her the future of our family, a bright, warm continuation of the legacy of love I had spent a lifetime building. I would look at them across the dinner table, my handsome, successful son and his charming, adoring wife, and a profound sense of peace would wash over me. My family was complete. My life's work was a success. I was so blissfully, so utterly, so devastatingly wrong. The first cracks in the perfect facade were nearly invisible, hairline fractures you would miss entirely if you weren't looking for them. They began not with arguments or overt disrespect, but with innocent-sounding questions, dropped casually into conversations like sugar cubes into tea, sweetening a bitter intent. We were sitting on the wide porch of the lake house one brilliant July afternoon, the one Frank and I had built with our own hands, board by board. Chloe looked out over the sparkling water, a picture of contentment. "This place must be worth a fortune now, Mom," she said, her voice light and breezy. "Have you ever had it appraised? Just for insurance purposes, of course." I dismissed it as simple, practical curiosity. "Oh, I wouldn't know, dear," I'd replied, smiling. "To me, its value is in the memories." A few weeks later, Daniel called. His tone was different, more businesslike. "Mom, Chloe and I were just talking about estate planning," he said. "It's important to have things in order. Do you know where Dad kept the original deed for the house?" The questions, always cloaked in practicality and concern, kept coming. They were little probes, testing the waters of my finances, mapping the landscape of my assets. Daniel, who once filled our calls with stories about his work and his passions, now spoke a new language, the language of market values, legacies, and inheritances. His words were often prefaced with, "Chloe was just wondering," and I watched with a growing, unnamed dread as my son's voice slowly became an echo of his wife's ambitions. I should have seen the pattern then, but a mother's heart is a stubborn, foolish organ. It clings desperately to the best version of its children, refusing to see the shadows lengthening around them. I became an expert at self-deception. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, a lonely old woman reading too much into things. "He's just stressed about work. That's why he seems so distant," I'd reason after Daniel cut a phone call short. "She's young, and it's smart for her to be thinking about their future," I'd tell myself after another one of Chloe's innocent inquiries about the contents of my will. I chose to believe their excuses. I chose to paint over the cracks with the thick, opaque whitewash of my own desperate hope. I convinced myself that this was just a phase, that the loving son and the sweet daughter-in-law I adored were still there, just buried underneath the heavy pressures of modern life. To admit otherwise, to even whisper the possibility of their changing hearts to myself in the dead of night, would have meant admitting that the family I had sacrificed every piece of myself for was beginning to rot from the inside out, and that was a truth far too painful to face. I am so glad you are here. If you are following this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and let me know what city you are listening from. I want to know how far our story has traveled. The transition from subtle inquiry to blatant exploitation began with a phone call that dripped with manufactured panic. It was Daniel, his voice strained and hesitant, a tone he hadn't used with me since he was a teenager admitting he had dented the family car. "Mom," he started, his words carefully measured, "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't a real emergency, but Chloe has this incredible business opportunity." He spoke of a friend's tech startup, a revolutionary new app that was a sure thing, a chance to get in on the ground floor of the next big thing. The details were conspicuously vague. When I asked for a business plan, a website, or even the name of this brilliant friend, he deflected with practiced ease. "It's all very confidential right now, Mom. You know, non-disclosure agreements, legal stuff. But Chloe has a great instinct for these things. We could double our investment in 6 months, maybe less." Through the phone, I could hear Chloe in the background, her whispers like a prompter in a play, feeding him his lines. A small, rational voice in my head, a voice that sounded uncannily like my late husband, Frank, screamed at me to say no, to ask for proof, to demand clarity. But then Daniel played his trump card, his voice cracking with just the right amount of vulnerability. "We just need a little help to get started, just this once, I promise." Those were the magic words. just this once. For the love of my son and for the desperate hope of proving my worth to them, I went to the bank the next day. I withdrew $20,000 from the savings account Frank and I had so carefully built over 40 years of frugal living. It was a significant portion of my safety net, a buffer against the uncertainties of old age. But as I handed the cashier's check to Daniel, I told myself it wasn't an expense, it was an investment in their future. That just this once became a gateway, opening the floodgates to a torrent of financial demands. The sure thing startup quietly and predictably failed, a topic that was never mentioned again, but the precedent had been set. I had proven myself to be a source of easily accessible, no questions asked capital. My life savings became their emergency fund. The requests became a regular feature of my life, each one wrapped in a new, more elaborate story of urgent need. It started with $5,000 for a major, unexpected car repair on their brand new SUV, though the vehicle never seemed to spend a day at the mechanic. Then came $3,000 for a series of professional development courses for Chloe, vague online seminars that seemed to have no curriculum and produced no tangible skills, but which were apparently essential for her personal growth. The audacity grew with each successful transaction. Soon, they weren't even emergencies. "Mom, we're so burnt out," Daniel would say, his voice weary. "We found this amazing, non-refundable deal for a trip to the Caribbean, but we're just a little short." I was never invited, of course. My role was not to enjoy the sun and sand, but to fund it from my quiet, lonely apartment. I would see the pictures later on their social media pages. Chloe posing in a new bikini, Daniel holding a colorful cocktail, their smiles wide and carefree against a backdrop of turquoise water. They would caption the photos with #blessed, and I would feel a hollow, metallic ache in my chest. I was the silent, uncredited sponsor of their blessed life, the invisible engine running on a dwindling fuel of maternal love and carefully saved dollars. I had ceased to be a mother. I had become their personal ATM, and the only transaction they offered in return was the increasingly flimsy illusion that I was still a part of their lives. The final, unforgivable act, the one that would shatter all illusions, came on Labor Day weekend. The air in Michigan was beginning to carry that crisp, melancholic promise of autumn, a season of beautiful decay. I yearned for the quiet solitude of our lake house, my truest sanctuary. It was a place where the ghost of Frank's laughter still echoed in the rustling pines, and where my own thoughts could stretch out and breathe. I had called Daniel earlier in the week, a ritual I never missed, to let him know I was planning to drive up for the long weekend. "Oh, that's great, Mom," he'd said, his voice unusually rushed and distant. "But just so you know, we're completely swamped this weekend. Chloe's got a big work deadline. That house will be all yours." I felt a familiar pang of disappointment that he and Chloe wouldn't be joining me, but it was quickly replaced by the anticipation of peace. I packed a small overnight bag, my well-worn gardening gloves, and a new mystery novel, imagining a perfect weekend of pulling weeds from my beloved rose bushes and reading by the water's edge. The 2-hour drive was a soothing balm, the trees along the highway just beginning to blush with the first hints of their fiery autumn transformation. A sense of calm, deep and reassuring, settled over me as I turned down the long gravel driveway that led to the house I had helped design, the house whose deed bore my name alongside Frank's, the house that was legally and spiritually mine. But the peace shattered into a million pieces the moment I rounded the final bend. The driveway was not empty. It was packed with unfamiliar, expensive cars, a shiny black BMW, a new silver Lexus, a red convertible I didn't recognize. Loud, pulsating music, the kind Chloe favored, was blasting from the deck, and the air, instead of smelling of pine and damp earth, reeked of barbecue smoke and spilt beer. My old, reliable sedan looked comically out of place at the end of the line. I parked and walked toward the chaos, my heart beginning a frantic, hammering rhythm against my ribs. The lawn was a battlefield of plastic cups and discarded napkins. A group of strangers I'd never seen before were playing a loud game of cornhole right on top of the patch where my prize-winning roses grew. And then I saw her, Chloe. She was the queen of this usurped castle, standing on the porch with a cocktail in her hand, holding court with a group of equally well-dressed people. When her eyes landed on me, her smile didn't falter for a second. It hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Her cold, dismissive gaze swept over my simple cotton dress and my worn-out gardening shoes as if I were a particularly unpleasant insect. She didn't walk over, she didn't wave, she just stood there, and in a voice loud enough for her entire court to hear, she turned to the woman beside her and said, with a dramatic roll of her eyes, "Oh God, look what the cat dragged in." Then she looked directly at my son, Daniel, who was standing by the grill flipping hamburgers, and she shouted the words that would ignite a war. "Why is that old leech here? We don't have space." Daniel froze, the spatula hovering in midair. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a flicker of what might have been shame. And then he did the most cowardly, most unforgivable thing I have ever seen a man do. He turned his back on me, his own mother, and pretended to be intensely busy with the meat on the grill. I don't remember the drive back. It's a black hole in my memory, a stretch of highway erased by a white fog of pure shock and pain. My hands must have been on the steering wheel, my foot on the gas pedal, but my mind was a million miles away. The only thing I could hear was Chloe's voice, sharp and venomous, echoing in the cavern of my skull, repeating the word leech until it lost all meaning and became just a sound of pure hatred. And the only thing I could see, projected onto the inside of my eyelids, was Daniel's back, a solid wall of cowardice that had just irrevocably shut me out of his life, out of the family I had poured my soul into building. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent, blurring the road ahead into a meaningless watercolor of betrayal. I had to pull over twice on the shoulder of the highway, my body racked with sobs so violent they felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside. I, Evelyn Reed, who had faced widowhood with quiet dignity, who had worked her fingers to the bone without complaint, was now a leech, an unwanted parasite in my own home, in my own life. I couldn't go back to my apartment. The silence there would be deafening. The memories of the boy who once thought I was his entire world would be ghosts that would haunt me. Instead, I saw the flickering neon sign of a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with worn-out carpets and the faint smell of disinfectant. I paid the $45 in cash, my hand trembling so badly I could barely sign the register with a name that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. Inside the cold, impersonal room, I collapsed onto the stiff, unforgiving bedspread, and the dam finally broke. I cried for the sweet, loving boy I had lost, the one who had been hollowed out and replaced by a spineless stranger. I cried for the charming, sweet daughter-in-law I thought I had, who had revealed herself to be a venomous, cruel monster. I cried for my husband, Frank, and for the first time, I was profoundly, achingly glad he wasn't alive to see what had become of our son. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was raw. In that lonely, anonymous motel room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 other solitary travelers, I felt utterly and completely alone, abandoned by the one person on earth I thought would love me forever. Sometime in the pre-dawn stillness of that sterile motel room, the tears stopped. They didn't just dry up, they froze, crystallizing in my soul. The profound, heart-wrenching sorrow that had hollowed me out began to curdle, transmuting into something else entirely. It became a cold, hard, and dangerously calm rage. I sat up in bed and saw my reflection in the dark television screen across the room. A 72-year-old woman with puffy eyes and disheveled graying hair, the very picture of a frail, defeated victim. But the woman I felt on the inside was anything but frail. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was years ago, just after a business partner had tried to cheat Frank out of a significant sum. Frank wasn't a man given to anger, but his eyes had a steel-like glint that night that I had rarely seen. He had taken my hands in his grip firm. "Evelyn," he'd said, his voice low and serious, "you are the kindest, most generous woman I know, but don't ever let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. If someone wrongs you, truly wrongs you, you don't owe them your grace. You owe it to yourself to make them understand that actions have consequences." For years, I had held on to my grace as if it were a shield. I had forgiven the small slights, the forgotten phone calls, the endless requests for money that were really demands in disguise. I had absorbed their selfishness and called it love. But this was different. This wasn't a slight. It was an assassination. They had attempted to assassinate my character, my role in the family, my very right to exist in the spaces I had created. My well of grace had run dry. Frank's words echoed in my mind, a ghostly permission slip from the man I trusted most. I would not be a victim. I would not fade away into a lonely, quiet life of whispered regrets. They had made the fatal error of mistaking my kindness for weakness, and I was about to teach them a lesson in consequences that would be both thorough and expensive. My mind, once a chaotic storm of grief, began to clear with an almost frightening precision. The logic and meticulous planning that I had once applied to managing household budgets and tailoring intricate sewing patterns now focused on a new, more ruthless project, the deconstruction of their lives. I started to mentally lay out all the events of the past few years, not as a grieving mother, but as a forensic accountant. The innocent questions about the lake house's value, the once-in-a-lifetime investment that vanished without a trace, the constant draining requests for money, each with its own dramatic backstory, the slow, calculated erosion of my place in their lives. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a campaign. It was a deliberate, systematic strategy designed to take everything from me, piece by piece, until all that was left was an estate to be claimed. And then another memory of Frank surfaced, this one more potent than the last. It was a conversation we'd had just a few months before he passed. He had just come from updating his will with his lawyer, old Mr. Howard. He had come home that evening looking unusually thoughtful. "I added something special, Ev," he had told me, tapping the worn leather briefcase that held the document. "A little insurance policy, just in case." I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. I had dismissed it as the cautious planning of a man facing his own mortality. But now, in the cold, harsh light of this new reality, I knew exactly what my first step had to be. I had to find that will. I had to find Frank's insurance policy. The following morning, I didn't waste time with tears. I checked out of the motel, my movements precise and deliberate. I didn't drive back to the lake house, the scene of my humiliation. Instead, I drove straight to my small, quiet apartment in the city, the place they likely imagined I was hiding in, broken and weeping. I walked in with a newfound purpose, my steps firm and steady on the familiar hardwood floors. I ignored the photographs on the mantelpiece, smiling ghosts of a happy family that had never truly existed. My destination was the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, a wedding gift from my parents that smelled of lavender and the passage of time. I lifted the heavy lid, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm, not with fear, but with anticipation. Beneath stacks of old linens, baby blankets, and Daniel's first tiny pair of shoes, My fingers found what I was searching for, a large, sealed manila envelope. Frank's handwriting, bold and unmistakable, was scrawled across the front, "For Evelyn's eyes only." I had never opened it. In the years since his death, I had respected his privacy, and frankly, I never imagined a scenario so dire that I would need to. Now, with hands that did not tremble, I slit the seal with a silver letter opener. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the original ribbon-bound copy of his last will and testament. The second was a personal letter, its envelope sealed with a small wax R for Reed. I opened the letter first. His words, his voice reached out to me from beyond the grave. "My dearest Ev," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are facing the storm I always feared would come. I have seen the way Chloe looks at our son, and more importantly, I have seen the weakness in our son's eyes when he looks at her. Love can be a beautiful, strengthening thing, but it can also be a blinding poison. I fear they will try to take advantage of your good heart, to mistake your love for a weakness to be exploited. I have prepared for this. Do not be afraid. Call Howard. He knows what to do. Remember, my love, you are stronger than you think. All my love forever, Frank." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of profound gratitude and a renewed love for the man who, even in death, was still protecting me. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Howard and Associates, the law firm Frank had trusted for over 40 years. "Mr. Howard's office," a crisp, professional voice answered. "This is Evelyn Reed," I said, my own voice clear and strong, without a hint of the broken woman I had been just 24 hours before. "I need to schedule an urgent appointment with Mr. Howard. It is a private matter regarding the estate of my late husband, Frank Reed." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then the receptionist's tone softened with recognition and a hint of urgency. "Of course, Mrs. Reed. Mr. Howard left specific standing instructions. If you ever called regarding this matter, he was to clear his schedule immediately. Can you come in this afternoon at 2? I arrived at his downtown office at 2 o'clock sharp, carrying the sealed will and Frank's letter in my handbag. Mr. Howard, now a man in his late 70s, with kind, wise eyes behind thick spectacles, greeted me not with the pity one offers a grieving widow, but with a look of profound, knowing respect. I sat across from his large mahogany desk and told him everything. The years of financial draining, the calculated questions, the ultimate humiliation at the lake house, Daniel's spineless betrayal. I didn't cry. I stated the facts calmly and precisely. When I finished, I handed him Frank's letter. He read it slowly, his expression growing grim. He looked up at me, his gaze steady. "Frank was a very wise man, Evelyn," he said, his voice somber. "He saw this coming. He hoped with all his heart that he was wrong, but he prepared for the worst. And in doing so, he left you with the perfect weapon to fight back." Mr. Howard leaned back in his large, creaking leather chair, the late afternoon sun casting long, dramatic shadows across his book-lined office. "The absolute genius of Frank's plan," he began, a small, strategic smile playing on his lips, "lies in its patience. He knew that a direct, emotional confrontation would only allow them to twist the narrative, to paint you as a hysterical, grieving widow and themselves as concerned, misunderstood children. So we will not confront them, not yet." My heart, which had been racing with a torrent of vengeful energy, slowed to a steady, patient beat. He was right. A shouting match would be a victory for them. It would be the drama they expected. This required the cold, precise execution of a legal dismantling. "For the time being," he continued, his fingertips steepled together, "you will do the most difficult thing imaginable. Nothing. You will go home. You will not answer their calls. You will not respond to their texts. You will become a ghost in their lives. Let them believe you are exactly what they think you are, a broken, defeated woman holed up in your apartment, wallowing in grief and incapable of action. Let their arrogance fester. The more confident they become, the more mistakes they will make, and the deeper the trap they will dig for themselves. The plan was brilliant in its cruelty. It was a psychological war of attrition, fought not on a battlefield of angry words, but in the unnerving, deafening space of my absence. They were expecting tears, pleas for forgiveness, a desperate clinging. I would give them nothing but absolute, impenetrable silence. My new role was to play the part of a shattered old woman, and after the initial raw sting of the betrayal, I found I was a surprisingly natural actress. My silence was my script. Meanwhile, Mr. Howard began the quiet, meticulous work of preparing the legal battlefield. His firm drafted the necessary legal notices to be filed at the perfect moment. His paralegals began compiling a comprehensive financial record, documenting every check I had written, every bank transfer I had made to them over the years. They prepared a formal petition to the probate court. His team also began the process of legally notifying all relevant financial institutions of an impending, thorough review of Frank's estate, a strategic move that would effectively freeze all major assets and prevent Daniel and Chloe from making any sudden moves to liquidate or transfer funds. He also advised me to do something I hadn't considered, a move of pure defensive genius. Go to your doctor, Evelyn, tomorrow, get a full physical and, most importantly, a comprehensive mental competency evaluation. Let's get it on record, dated today, that you are of perfectly sound mind and body. It will completely neutralize any attempt they might make to have you declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. I followed his advice to the letter. The doctor's report was glowing, my blood pressure was excellent, and my cognitive tests placed me in the top percentile for my age group. My mind was as sharp as a tack. I was armed, I was vetted, and I was ready. Then, Mr. Howard finally revealed the masterstroke, the hidden weapon Frank had so carefully left for me. He slid the original ribbon-bound will across his polished mahogany desk. "Read Article 4, Section B," he said, his voice low and imbued with the gravity of the moment. I put on my reading glasses, my hands surprisingly steady, and found the section. My breath caught in my throat as I read the elegant, lethal legalese. It was what Frank had called his insurance policy, but what Mr. Howard fondly referred to as the cruelty clause. The clause was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. It stated that if, at any point after his death, I, his beloved and cherished wife Evelyn Reed, was subjected to what the court would reasonably deem willful neglect, emotional cruelty, or was barred from my rightful and habitual residence by any primary beneficiary of this will, then the primary distribution of the estate, as outlined in the previous articles, would be rendered entirely null and void. In that event, the entirety of Frank's considerable assets, the houses, the stocks, the savings, every last penny, was to be immediately and irrevocably liquidated and transferred to a single alternate beneficiary, the Michigan Lakes Feline Sanctuary, a local no-kill cat shelter that Frank and I had occasionally donated $20 to. It was a work of pure, understated genius. Frank hadn't just protected me. He had chosen a beneficiary so humbling, so utterly and comically unexpected that the fall from grace for Daniel and Chloe would be absolute. They weren't just going to lose their inheritance, they were going to lose it to a legion of stray cats. For 2 long, silent weeks, I followed Mr. Howard's instructions to the letter, becoming a recluse in my own apartment. My phone became a testament to their escalating panic. I let every call go to voicemail, and each evening I would listen to the recordings, not with pain, but with the detached interest of a strategist studying her opponents. The first few messages from Daniel were laced with a transparently false concern. "Mom, are you okay? We're really getting worried about you. Please just let us know you're all right." When those received no reply, the tone shifted to frustration. "Mom, seriously, you need to call us back. This silent treatment is childish and it's not solving anything." Finally, their messages became what they truly were: demands. "Evelyn, you need to stop this and talk to us. We need to discuss the future of the estate. You can't just ignore your responsibilities." I would listen to them all, a cold, quiet sense of satisfaction growing within me. They weren't worried about me, they were worried about their access to the money. Their inability to reach me made them reckless, and just as Mr. Howard had predicted, they made their move. They hired their own lawyer, a flashy young man whose smirking face I saw on a bus stop advertisement, and formally initiated probate proceedings. The documents they filed were based on the copy of the will they possessed, a copy that, of course, did not contain the hidden wax-sealed addendum with Frank's devastating cruelty clause. They were moving swiftly to have Daniel appointed as the sole executor of the estate, citing my fragile emotional state and prolonged grief as a primary reason I was unfit to handle such complex matters myself. They were walking straight into the meticulously set snare. The final piece of the trap fell into place when their lawyer, a Mr. Slate, sent me a formal, registered letter. The thick, cream-colored envelope felt heavy with their arrogance. It was a summons requesting my presence at a meeting at his office to facilitate the smooth and amicable transition of the estate's assets. They wanted my signature on a stack of documents. Documents that would legally acknowledge Daniel as the executor. Documents that would grant him the power to put the lake house on the market immediately. Documents that would effectively strip me of any control. This was it, the moment we had been patiently waiting for. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Howard, my voice steady and clear. "They've taken the bait," I said, a tremor of adrenaline, not fear, running through me. "Perfect," he replied, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Accept the meeting, Evelyn. Call Daniel directly. Tell him you will be there, and tell him you will be coming alone." I did as he asked. I dialed my son's number, and when he answered, I summoned every bit of my acting ability, allowing a slight, weary tremor into my voice. "Daniel, dear," I said, putting on my best performance of a defeated old woman. "I received the letter from your lawyer. I'm so tired, son. I'm tired of fighting. You're right, it's time to settle things. I'll be there on Tuesday." I could almost hear the triumphant smirk forming on his face through the phone line. "That's a good decision, Mom," he said, his voice softening with condescending pity. "It's for the best, you'll see." They were so utterly convinced they had won. They pictured me walking into that meeting, a broken, grieving widow, ready to sign away her life's security for a sliver of peace. They had no idea I was walking in as a queen, about to checkmate their entire game. The meeting was held in the sleek, impersonal conference room of their lawyer's downtown office. The air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and smug victory. Daniel and Chloe were already seated at the head of a long, reflective glass table when I was shown in. They had dressed for the occasion of my surrender. Chloe wore a sharp, tailored power suit, looking every bit the corporate shark about to close a deal. Daniel sat beside her, his posture rigid, trying to project an air of solemn authority that he simply didn't possess. They both looked up as I entered, their expressions a well-rehearsed symphony of sympathy and impatience. "Mom, thank you for coming," Daniel said, his voice resonating with false gravity as he gestured to the empty chair across from them. We know this is difficult, and we appreciate you being reasonable." I sat down slowly, deliberately placing my old, worn handbag on the gleaming table, a stark contrast to their polished briefcases. I said nothing. Their lawyer, Mr. Slate, a man with more hair gel than sincerity, slid a thick stack of documents toward me. "Mrs. Reed," he began, his voice as smooth and oily as his hair, "these are purely standard probate documents. They simply appoint Daniel as the executor of the estate and allow us to begin the process of liquidating certain assets, including the valuable lake house property, as per your late husband's wishes." He pushed an expensive-looking fountain pen toward me. Chloe leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper dripping with false sweetness. "It's just to make things easier for you, Mom. We'll handle all the stressful paperwork. You won't have to worry about a thing." It was at that precise, perfect moment that the conference room door opened without a knock. Mr. Howard walked in. His presence, grounded in decades of quiet, unshakable integrity, instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. He carried a single, worn leather briefcase that had probably seen more real justice than Mr. Slate's entire office. Daniel and Chloe stared, their mouths hanging slightly agape, their carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "Mr. Howard?" Daniel stammered, his voice a full octave higher than before. "What are you doing here?" "I am here representing my client, Mrs. Evelyn Reed," Mr. Howard said calmly, taking the empty seat beside me. He gave a slight, professional nod to their lawyer. "Mr. Slate, a pleasure. I believe the documents you have so kindly prepared are based on an incomplete and therefore invalid version of Mr. Frank Reed's will." Mr. Slate frowned, puffing out his chest. "I have a notarized copy, signed and dated by Mr. Reed." "Indeed, you have a copy," Mr. Howard replied, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But you seem to be missing the original, along with its legally binding sealed codicil." With a theatrical slowness that was pure genius, Mr. Howard opened his briefcase and produced the authentic ribbon-bound will. He then took out a smaller, secondary envelope, its back sealed with a faded wax R. "This addendum," he announced to the stunned room, "was to be opened only under a very specific set of circumstances which, I am sorry to say, have been tragically and definitively met." He then laid out his own documents on the table, signed and notarized affidavits from my neighbors at the lake, graphically detailing the events of Labor Day weekend. He presented my doctor's report, a clean bill of both physical and mental health. Finally, he produced the bank statements, a damning chronicle of the $60,000 I had transferred to them over the past 3 years. "The evidence of willful neglect and emotional cruelty is, I'm afraid, irrefutable," Mr. Howard stated, his calm eyes fixed on Daniel and Chloe, who now looked like cornered animals. "Which brings us to Article 4, Section B of the True Will." Mr. Howard put on his own reading glasses, the silence in the room so absolute that the soft click of the frames opening sounded like a gunshot. He cleared his throat, not for effect, but with the quiet deliberation of a man about to deliver a final, unappealable judgment. He began to read from the original will, his voice calm and measured, each word landing on the glass table like a stone. "In the event," he read, "that my wife, Evelyn Reed, is subjected to willful neglect, emotional cruelty, or is barred from her rightful and habitual residence by any primary beneficiary of this will." He paused, his gaze lifting from the page to look over his glasses directly at Daniel. "Then, the primary distribution of my estate, as outlined in Article 3, shall be rendered immediately and irrevocably null and void." Chloe's face, which had been pale, now seemed to be made of chalk. What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice a strained, rasping sound that was barely human. Mr. Howard ignored her, his attention fully on the text. He continued reading, his voice unwavering. In said event, the entirety of my estate, including all real property, stocks, bonds, and the contents of all savings and investment accounts, shall be liquidated by the executor, and the total sum shall be transferred in its entirety to a single alternate beneficiary. He let the suspense hang in the air for a single perfect second before delivering the final blow. The Michigan Lakes Feline Sanctuary. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's air conditioning and Chloe's sharp, ragged breathing. Daniel stared at Mr. Howard as if the old lawyer had suddenly started speaking in tongues. Chloe's perfectly made-up face began to crumble, the mask of composure shattering into a grotesque caricature of disbelief and rage. "A cat shelter?" she finally shrieked, her voice cracking and rising to a hysterical pitch. "He left everything to a goddamn cat shelter?" "He did," Mr. Howard confirmed, closing the will with a soft final snap. "And the act of barring Mrs. Reed from her home on Labor Day weekend, an event for which we have multiple sworn witnesses, served as the undeniable legal trigger for this clause." He then turned his calm, implacable gaze to their lawyer. "My office has already filed the necessary petitions with the probate court this morning. The process of transferring the assets is already in motion." That was the moment they finally, completely broke. The carefully constructed facade of control didn't just crack, it exploded. Chloe leaped to her feet, her expensive chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is your fault," she screamed, her finger jabbing furiously at Daniel's chest. "You were too weak. You should have handled her when you had the chance." Daniel, for his part, seemed to have shrunk into his expensive suit. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror that was years too late. "Mom," he choked out, the word catching in his throat. "Mom, please, you can't let this happen. It was a mistake. We can fix this, please." But I just looked at him, my face a placid lake of calm, and for the first time in my entire life as his mother, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity. Just a profound, liberating emptiness. The leech had finally been detached, and it was starving. The aftermath of that meeting was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic collapse, swift and brutal. The probate court, presented with the irrefutable original will and the mountain of supporting evidence Mr. Howard had so meticulously compiled, acted with decisive speed. Within a matter of weeks, the entire estate of Frank Reed, every stock, every bond, every dollar, was legally and irrevocably transferred to the cat sanctuary. Daniel and Chloe lost everything they had been counting on, a future built on greed that evaporated into thin air. The beautiful lake house, the investment portfolio worth over $2 million, the antique collection Frank had spent a lifetime acquiring, it all vanished from their grasp as if it had been a dream. But the consequences didn't stop with the inheritance. The comfortable, stylish house they were living in, the one I had helped them secure the down payment for by selling my mother's necklace, was technically owned by Frank's trust. The Michigan Lakes Feline Sanctuary, now the legal and very motivated owner, had no interest in being landlords to the people who had inadvertently made them wealthy. An eviction notice, formal and impersonal, was served. They were given 30 days to vacate the premises. Their frantic attempts to fight it were futile. The will was ironclad. They were forced to sell their luxury cars, Chloe's designer handbags, and Daniel's expensive watches in a desperate scramble to afford the deposit on a small, cramped apartment in a rundown part of town. To add insult to injury, Mr. Howard pursued the civil suit against them for the $60,000 I had given them under false pretenses. The court ruled in my favor, of course, placing a lien on any future earnings they might have until the debt, with interest, was repaid in full. The social fallout was just as devastating. A public shaming played out in the small theater of our community. News travels fast, especially a story as juicy as this one. The tale of the greedy son and his manipulative wife who lost a multi-million-dollar inheritance to a clouder of cats because they were cruel to their own mother became the stuff of local legend. It was whispered about in the grocery store, discussed over coffee at the local diner, and dissected at bridge clubs. People who had once admired their perfect life and their rapid success now crossed the street to avoid them. Chloe's family, who had been so happy to party at my lake house and benefit from her marriage, suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. The shame was a poison that seeped into every corner of their lives. Their marriage, built on a foundation of shared greed and ambition, couldn't survive the weight of their failure. The recriminations were endless. She accused him of being a weak, pathetic mama's boy who couldn't control his own mother. He accused her of being a greedy, manipulative monster who had poisoned his mind and ruined his life. They filed for divorce less than 6 months later, a bitter, ugly affair where they fought viciously over the few remaining scraps of their former life. Daniel, his reputation in tatters, was quietly let go from his high-paying job. No respectable firm wanted to employ a man who had been so publicly and legally exposed for trying to defraud his own mother. He ended up taking a low-level, commission-based sales job, a man crushed by debt, shame, and the heavy burden of his own choices. A few months after the court proceedings had finally settled and the dust of my old life had cleared, I drove to the Michigan Lakes Feline Sanctuary. It was a modest, cheerful place filled with the constant, soothing sound of purring and the gentle warmth of animals who had, like me, found a safe harbor. I was greeted at the door by the director, a kind, middle-aged woman named Sarah, whose eyes welled up with tears when I introduced myself. "Mrs. Reed," she said, shaking my hand with both of hers, "you are our angel, you and your late husband." Frank's final, brilliant act of love had transformed their small, struggling operation overnight. They were now able to build a new, state-of-the-art medical wing for sick and elderly cats, hire a full-time veterinarian, and establish a fund that would ensure the sanctuary's future for decades to come. I took out my own checkbook, using my personal private funds, not a penny from Frank's estate, and wrote a substantial check. "I'd like to fund a new, fully enclosed outdoor porch," I told her, "a place where they can feel the sun on their fur and watch the birds. Please just put a small plaque on it." The plaque was simple. It read, "The Frank Reed Memorial Sunshine Porch, in memory of a man who understood loyalty." I started volunteering there twice a week, finding a quiet, profound joy in brushing the coats of old tomcats and bottle-feeding tiny kittens, creatures who gave love without condition or calculation. My life found a new, peaceful rhythm. I sold the big, empty family house in the city and bought a small, beautiful cottage right on the lake, not far from the house Frank and I had built. I had my garden, my books, and the company of my new feline friends. A year after his divorce, my son, Daniel, reached out. He was a changed man, humbled, broken, but finally, achingly honest. We met for coffee in a neutral place. He didn't ask for money. He asked, his voice trembling, for forgiveness. I didn't offer him a handout or an easy absolution, but I did offer him a chance to slowly, very slowly, rebuild a bridge. The path to redemption is long, and it is a path he has to walk by himself. My late husband taught me a final, powerful lesson. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer those who betray you is to let them experience the full, unvarnished consequences of their own choices. And sometimes you discover that the most loyal and loving family members are the ones with 4 paws, a twitching tail, and a comforting, unconditional purr.